I'm Brian McNamara, and in this video, I'll cover how to use Visual Studio 2010 to manage F-Sharp projects and solutions. This screencast will cover a definition of Visual Studio projects and solutions, how to add references to a project to use .NET libraries, adding and removing source code files in a project, project properties and configurations, and a few other miscellaneous topics. Projects and solutions in Visual Studio. In Visual Studio, a project is simply a collection of all the information needed to compile a .NET assembly, that is, a DLL or exe. Here I have an F-Sharp project. It contains, among other things, a number of source code files, a number of referenced libraries, as well as other properties, all of which influence the command line sent to the F-Sharp compiler. We'll talk about each of these a little bit more shortly. Projects are listed in the Solution Explorer. If the Solution Explorer window is hidden, you can bring it up via the View menu. Select Solution Explorer. A Visual Studio solution is simply a collection of projects. Here I have an F-Sharp application project, as well as a C# library project in this solution. Adding references to use libraries. In Visual Studio, if I want to use a particular library, I need to add a reference to it to my project. Here I have some F-Sharp code that prints a summary of an RSS feed. You'll notice my code has error squiggles. The first one says, the namespace XML is not defined. In this case, I want to use the XML reader class, which is a class that's part of the .NET framework. In order to use that class, I need to add a reference to the corresponding library, in this case, system.xml. I can right-click on the References node in my project and say Add Reference, and this will bring up the Add Reference dialog. It has a number of tabs. I'm going to click on the .NET tab since I want to add a reference to a library that's part of the .NET framework. In this case, I want a reference to system.xml. I'll click on it and click OK. And then we'll see that system.xml has been added to the references in my project, and the error squiggle on system.xml has gone away. There's one other library I need here. For this sample, I want to use the syndication feed class, and I know that's part of system.serviceModel. So once again, I'll bring up the Add Reference dialog, go to the .NET tab, select system.serviceModel, and add it to my project. Now system.serviceModel is in the list of references, and the rest of my error squiggles have gone away. This bit of F-Sharp code just loads an RSS feed from a particular URL, prints out the feed title, followed by a list of items, their publishing date, and titles. If I run this code, we see that it prints out a summary of the RSS feed of my blog. Suppose now I want to use a library from another project in my solution. Recall that my solution contains a C# class library called Class Library 1. It contains some code seen here, including this method, which looks like it may be useful. If I want to be able to call this method from my F-Sharp code, I'll need to add a reference to this C# library. Once again, I can do that by selecting the References node of my F-Sharp project, clicking on Add Reference, but this time I'll select the Projects tab on the Add Reference dialog. This lists the other projects in my solution. Here I want to add a reference to Class Library 1, so I'll select it and then press OK. And we can see Class Library 1 has been added to the references, and now I'll be able to access the code from that other project. Adding, removing, and ordering source code files in a project. There are two main ways I can add new items to a project. If I right-click on the project, the context menus contain Add New Item and Existing Item. A new item is one that we'll create from scratch, whereas an existing item is one that already exists on disk. It just so happens that I already have some code on disk. If I go to the Project Context menu again and select Open Folder in Windows Explorer, it will open the folder containing this project. And here I can see I've already created a file called File2 that's not currently part of my project. I can add this code to my project by saying Add, Existing Item, and then selecting File2 and clicking Add. This adds file2.fs to my project. If I take a look at the code in this file, it's just calling the method in the C# class library that I just added a project reference to. Suppose I want to use this method in module file2 in my main program. I can try to use it here, but I'll get an error squiggle saying module 2 is not defined. In F#, entities must always be defined before they can be used, and this includes file order. Right now, file2 is coming after program.fs. I need to move it so it's before, and I can do this by right-clicking on the file, and then from the context menu, selecting Move Up, or using the keyboard shortcut Alt-Up to move this file up in the list. Here I just moved file2 up above program.fs. If I use the keyboard shortcuts Alt-Up or Alt-Down, you see how I can reorder the files in the list. Here I want file2 right above program.fs. And now that it's above it, my error squiggles have gone away, and I can run the program. Wow, it seems my computer is pretty fast. Whenever I add an item via the Project Context menu, Add New Item or Existing Item, it will get added to the bottom of the list of files, as we've seen before. If instead I want to insert a new item somewhere else in the list, I can click on a particular item and then use Add Above or Add Below to add it in a particular location. So for example, if I want to insert a new item between File 1 and File 2, I could click on File 1 and say Add Below New Item, and then add an F# source code file called File 3 to that location, and it will be added in that location in the project. If I want to delete an item, I can right-click on that item and either use Exclude from Project or Delete. Delete will delete the file from disk as well as removing it from the project, whereas Exclude from Project will remove the file from the project but leave the file on disk. Here I'm happy to delete the file, and I get a warning before I can delete it. Project Properties and Configurations. We've already seen how I can add new references or source code items to a project, but there are other project properties I may need to modify as well. To access those properties, I can right-click on my F# project and select Properties. This will open the F# Project Properties dialog, which contains a number of different tabs. We'll take a look at a couple of them. On the Application tab, I can specify the assembly name, target framework, and output type. So for example, if I wanted to target .NET Framework 3.5, I could do it via this dialog. Typically, these are properties you'll specify when you first create a new project. On the Build tab, there are a number of other properties that affect how a project gets compiled. These properties are configuration dependent. Visual Studio provides a number of named configurations. By default, there are two configurations called Debug and Release. Depending upon what configuration is active, the various properties may change. So for example, if I'm in the debug configuration, I see that Define Debug Constant is checked and Optimize Code is unchecked. Whereas if I switch to the Release configuration Now debug is no longer defined, but code is getting optimized. These are the defaults that are part of the new project templates. We can see another way that configurations affect things in the source code editor. Here, since I'm in the release configuration, debug is not defined, which means this conditional code with if debug is currently grayed out, whereas the else portion is active. If I change to the debug configuration, the syntax highlighting switches, and now this code is active, whereas this code is grayed out. We can also see the effects of this in the command line when we build the project. The output window shows the command line for the F# compiler, which currently includes defining debug, since I'm in the debug configuration. If I switch to release and build the project, now the command line no longer contains define debug. There are a number of other features in the F# project system. I'll show a few briefly on the screen, but I won't go into detail. You can always learn more on your own. By default, when you add an existing item to an F# project, it will copy that file to the project directory. You can override this default by choosing Add as Link to link to a file that's in a different directory. If I right-click on a file and choose Properties, I can bring up this dialog, which shows a number of different properties associated with individual files. Finally, if I right-click on a project and unload it, I can then edit the underlying FSProj file. This is an MS-build file, roughly like a make file. It contains all the instructions for building the project, and can be used to build the project using msbuild.exe from the command line. As always, if you want to learn more about F#, you can visit my blog or the F# Developer Center at fsharp.net.